So thanks again. My name is Jim Ryman. I'm co-presenting with Mike Tobin from Document Security Systems, and we'd like to talk to you today about some emerging really changes in the brand protection market to become more predictive from their previous reactive stance, really. So we'll walk you through this. So the issue really is typically, brand protection strategies and tactics were aimed at nuisance level counterfeiters, really that were not serious contenders in terms of making this the plague that it's become today. Counterfeiting has often sorry, I got lost. So counterfeiters typically have been really small-time criminals and were bound by national borders typically. IP wasn't as open as it is today, and clearly reproduction technologies in terms of scanners and things like that weren't nearly as advanced as they are today either. And finally, online marketplaces really didn't exist when this whole process first started. And so what's happened over the last 10 or 12 years is that counterfeiting has increased more than 50% and now accounts for more than 2.5% of global trade. That's very significant. So as those markets have changed, as counterfeiters have changed, as they've become more sophisticated, it's clearly necessary for the brand protection markets to adapt and change as they do that. And in brand protection, technologies clearly have emerged, and that's required different skill sets throughout the organization. As IP has become more open, traditional brand protection technologies actually have perhaps raised the risk level for brand owners as well. And there clearly are additional stakeholders in this process. Brand protection used to be confined to the enforcement of things. Now it's become clearly a marketing activity in a lot of companies, and IT has certainly a very large stake in this as well. So one of the things you'll hear about today is this internet-enabled market, and the brand protection moving to be an internet-enabled solution throughout the world, and that really translates to big data. Most of you have heard the big data talk before, and this is just another area where it clearly has emerged. The democratization of these systems really means that everybody becomes a user, and that information is shared across not only companies, but industries, and clearly globally as well. So what we end up with is this reactive versus predictive model. And in the reactive model, again, the traditional model, we were looking at enforcement, which involves investigation, interdiction, and was mostly internally focused. The problems with that, or the issues with that, is the costs were very high. They often were not, there were international constraints, and they just weren't very productive or capable of solving these problems. In the predictive model, this is much more analytical. So we're looking at big data, and we're looking at trends, historical trends. It's much more cost effective. It's a much more sound solution, and in the long run, it's less expensive for sure. Mike?
Great, thanks, Jim. When you look at traditional brand protection technologies, take for example a hologram. Everyone's seen hologram on packages. It's been the cornerstone of brand protection for a lot of time. What's the problem with a hologram? I see something shiny on a package. Hey, it must be real, so I got a hologram on it. I can also buy holograms for half a cent from China. I can buy your brand's holograms for half a cent from China. There is no feedback involved in a hologram. It's like a fishing lure. Its sole purpose is to sit there and look shiny. It doesn't do much more than that. What we're talking about here is moving to technologies that start to provide feedback, that give you closed loop reporting. So you can suddenly understand what's going on out in the market. It's a shift from reactive to predictive by using data. So now as you start getting feedback from the field, as you start understanding what's going on out in the supply chain, as you start understanding what's going on in retail locations, that's really important information. So when we talk about a data-centric approach, what are we talking about here? We're in smartphone authentication, that's what we do. So, I'll use that as kind of my example. I mean, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So when in the data-centric approach, we mark boxes. That's what we do in our technology. We put it on your packaging. Secure mark, can't be copied, can't be photographed, can't be scanned. When somebody actually validates that mark out in the field, though, all sorts of information is captured. There is aggregated data that's transmitted back to the cloud. This is where we start getting into the idea of big data. So what can we find out? Well, each mark in our scenario, you see it with serialization and other things, each mark can be unique, can be batched. We can start associating data with that mark. Where was it manufactured? Who shipped it? Where is it supposed to be? And then there are dynamic factors that are part of this as well. Where is it? Where is somebody reading it? If it's supposed to be in the US and it's in Malaysia, you've got a problem. And that's really what we're talking about here. So all this through field authentication, and by the way, it doesn't matter if it's a consumer doing it, a brand inspector, somebody within the supply chain, a retail worker, all sorts of different places. It's the idea that it's generating data. That's really where the value starts coming in. And it's the archiving of this data over a long term that really starts to make the difference. Let's talk about drug enforcement, DEA efforts. They're not looking for the one deposit that somebody made. They're looking for a long-term system of deposits. They're trying to follow the money and look for data and trends of data to identify sources. That's where we start talking about getting predictive here. So that's ultimately all this collection of data starts to come in play. That accuracy over time, as you start to see the trends, starts to do really interesting things. Where is my problem originating from? What shipping company did it come through, for example? What port did it go through? Can you start to identify where those problems are so that you can take proactive steps to resolve it? Proactive intervention, amazing how that works. So data becomes the cornerstone of strategy development in business. This is true for just about all functions within companies now. I mean, I'm a marketing weenie. So, when I first got into marketing, you made a pretty brochure and you put it out there. That's not the case anymore. You're looking for data on who's come to your website. I get a report every morning of every company that's come to my website. It's a great sales tool. That's where data starts coming into play. Now we're just moving it into brand protection, a field that has traditionally been without it, yet it's actually a field that can benefit the most from it. So, like all use of data, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to collect this data, you're trying to distill this data, and you're trying to use it to deploy resources to the appropriate place. I can put 500 field investigators out there. That gets really expensive really quickly with so-so results. I'd rather have 10 field investigators very well informed about where the problems are occurring so they can really start responding to important things. That's what data does for you. The other interesting things that comes out of this is the sharing of data with other brands. Counterfeiters aren't just targeting your product. If a counterfeiter's out there, they are going for multiple products, multiple brands. So by sharing this data across the industry, you get even access to even more data. Now, of course, there are certain things you want to keep private. You don't want to give them the identity of your customers and things like that. But that's not ultimately what we're looking at for brand protection. We're looking at the aggregated data, the larger set of data. So the ports where there are problems are great ones, shipping companies where there are problems. If you can start to make that correlation across multiple silos, across multiple brands, you have an even better chance of identifying the bad actors. That's where we're starting to get to, and that's ultimately what we're looking for. It's the same approach used by law enforcement to catch terrorists, narco traffickers, any of the big organized crime rings. So, who here knows about blockchain? Raise your hand. I got two. Okay, great. So, blockchain is the technology behind the Bitcoin. Who here knows what a Bitcoin is? Got a few more. So, Bitcoin is a digital currency, essentially. If you might know it because it's gone astronomically high. But Bitcoin is based on a technology called blockchain. And blockchain is really interesting. So what blockchain does is it decentralizes things. And the model we're discussing does resemble blockchain in some respects. So what blockchain does is it uses distributed data to authenticate. Blockchain, so what happens with blockchain is when a Bitcoin is created, we'll call it Bitcoin number one. When Bitcoin number one was created, it's recorded in a ledger. They call it an immutable ledger. Why is it immutable? It's just a database. Well, Bitcoin is like Skynet from Terminator. Who's seen Terminator? The line Terminator, Skynet has infected every machine out there. There's no central core, so you can't disable it. You can't take it out. This is the same thing. So what has happened with blockchain is blockchain now applies to millions of computers around the world. People donate their computer space, and it does all the calculations and keep all these ledgers. So when Bitcoin number one is created, that's replicated across millions of databases throughout the world. Why does that help? Because now, when somebody breaks into one database, hacks it, changes that Bitcoin 1. Bitcoin 1 no longer belongs to Jim or to Mark. Bitcoin 1 now belongs to Mike because I broke in. Except for there are now 999 million other instances out there that says Bitcoin 1 still belongs to Jim. Therefore, that's thrown out. And that's ultimately what we're talking about. It's this aggregation of data where all this gets pulled together so that you're not just checking a printed mark or a hologram, you're also authenticating based on data. The problem with this is Bitcoin's a digital currency, so it was created to exist only in a digital format. What we're talking about is physical. If you're talking pharma or medical devices or auto parts or whatever it might be, that's a physical form. Getting that into the digital world becomes a little bit more difficult. But everything is automated now. Everyone's got systems that's recording this. All that data exists to measure against. The issue is getting it from its current systems into a system that can be accessed by everyone or everyone approved to access it. That's where the real difficulty is with this now. This also brings up the idea of algorithmic risk analysis. It's a really big sounding term that I came up with. I was really impressed with myself for it. And ultimately, any authentication is based on a risk analysis. I look at a hologram, I'm performing a risk analysis. Okay, do I think this is real? Sure, it's great. It's got something shiny on it. It's not a particularly good risk analysis. When you limit yourself to one factor, to one piece of data, is a very weak risk analysis. Ultimately, what's happening in brand protection right now is everyone's authenticating a mark or packaging, that one piece of data. This presents a problem because if it's printed, it can be counterfeited. Look at the US $100 bill. It's got every piece of security in the world integrated into it, but it can still be counterfeited. It still is counterfeited in major amounts of way. If we get algorithmic, though, suddenly we can start looking at additional factors. So, for example, I validate the mark. Okay, that's a valid mark. Where is it? Is it where it's supposed to be? If we're able to access the data and we know where it's supposed to be, and it's not, guess what? Now I got a real question as to whether this is authentic. You add 4, 5, 6 pieces of data in there. For example, GPS location. If it's in a notorious street market in Hong Kong, you can be pretty certain that it's not an authentic product. So it's the idea of layering in additional data to do this authentication. Now, were I a brand investigator, for example, and I had access to all this data and I could look it up on my laptop, that's what I'd do. Problem is, a consumer, retail worker, the vast majority of people in the supply chain cannot do that. So ultimately, this risk analysis, what we need to do is we need to look at a variety of different data, and you can basically do a weighted analysis on it so that you can return a score. Below a certain score is a problematic product. Something above a certain score is probably authentic. That's essentially what we're talking about here. So there's a lot of different data that you can use for this: intended destination, product, date from manufacturer, that you can look at, authorized outlets, propensity to counterfeit. If you've got a product line is heavily counterfeited, you're going to look at a lot of these factors more carefully. Added benefit can be done through serialization. If you're currently doing serialization, using the data from that serialization program, same thing. It just strengthens the overall solution. We do think that this has fundamental changes within the organization, particularly as it relates to brand protection. This is a fundamental change in how brand protection operates. Brand protection has primarily been printing people or packaging people, which is great, still involved, but now we're talking about IT systems, we're talking about systems integration, we're talking about ongoing services, managing a data initiative. That changes who needs to be involved. Investigation and field operations are still very important. We see this purely as a tool for them to help direct them better so they can be more effective. But we do see a lot of new skill sets that are required. People that can manage a solution, people that can do the data analysis, people that can look at data and figure out new ways, new things that they can implement from their systems. IT becomes very important with this. Obviously, we're talking systems, so IT people get much more involved. Marketing also plays a much bigger role. We see, it's funny, I've been in this field for about 18 months. 18 months ago, everyone was talking about brand investigators really as a security solution. Almost universally now, everyone's talking about consumers and adding consumer authentication. Almost every sales meeting we go on to is about moving some of this capability into the hands of consumers, particularly internationally. In the US, we get a little bit insulated from it because we have better controls in this country. Asia, Europe, a lot of other areas, it's becoming much more oriented towards consumers. The other thing about this is this data isn't just for brand protection. This becomes a strategic tool. All data becomes a strategic tool. So moving it into things like business intelligence systems. The enterprise is generating so much data now that to make sense of it, it needs to be paired with other things. So now suddenly we can start telling, okay, who's buying my product or looking at my product? What are they responding to on that product potentially? So it becomes something that fuels a lot of other initiatives in the company with a strong marketing connection, particularly if we start getting into consumer authentication. Because now you can start making recommendations on products. I read an analyst report the other day that said something like on Amazon's product sales, more than 50% of revenue comes from recommended products, things that people are buying in conjunction with their primary purchase. And that's the same sort of thing that we're talking about here. With this connection, engaged with somebody on mobile, now suddenly you have a direct connection to those people, that brand does. A couple of factors to consider, and then we'll take some questions. Supply chain complexity. This is the biggest issue we deal with. Everyone has such complicated supply chains with dozens of companies potentially touching product. So finding ways to implement and collect data is one of the hardest things to do. We recommend doing it in an iterative process. Start off simple and then kind of grow it over time. I don't know if any of you have implemented CRM systems or ERP systems. If you try to do the whole thing at once, it's an impossible task, and Accenture ends up making millions and millions in consulting dollars. Instead, start easy, start simple, and then ramp it up over time. This is not just a one-time purchase, this is an ongoing solution, and that's fundamental change. As we talked about, the integration with internal systems becomes very important. All this data, if you think of a brand protection program that's run over 3, 4, 5 years for some of the large brands, the amount of data that you potentially have is just enormous. So you've got to get it into your internal systems. You need to feed it into the business intelligence systems, marketing automation systems, all these different things, because that becomes something very valuable that you can use in additional ways beyond just brand protection. We see brand protection becoming a much more strategic tool for businesses rather than just a simple security solution.